Hello there, and welcome to Castle of Paint. My name is Ian, and today we'll be painting Kenobi! That is right, today we're painting the diplomat general himself, Obi-Wan Kenobi. The Star Wars Shatterpoint miniature is him in his wartime regalia in a very cool pose. Let's get him ready for the battlefield. As with all the paint jobs I've been doing recently, we first have to talk about light. The pose of Obi-Wan means that the angle he is facing, or the direction he is pointing at, his money shot is very narrow. So if I just have a light source coming that way, as I did on many other recent paint jobs, it will not cover much of the mini from the back or sides. I also have the light source from his lightsaber held very close to his face to consider. For this job I'll be putting my light source to the front and above the mini, but also with the front of his body facing the light source too. We don't want to just illuminate his rear. After I played with the light from our sun or light source, I take a blue light and shove it up close to where his blade would be casting light. I also take pictures during this and the previous process to refer to later. You can see them here now. Okay, I'm prepared. Let's do some painting. This time I'm going to paint in each section to completion before I move on to the next. We have the following sections: cloth, armor, skin, and miscellaneous. Oh, of course, and the base as well. Before I go on to the base, I want to lay down a nice shadow colour. For all the different bits of Obi, a nice dark royal blue will be a good shadow, and so I airbrush this over all the black. The first layer did not work out as I hoped, so after fighting with the airbrush and using another blue, I get it to the stage you see now. Since this new blue was brighter than I originally wanted, I chose to do a purple bit, airbrushing from below. First time using the airbrush on camera, and it went super poorly. Classic. I did this before the base, as otherwise the spray from the airbrush will cover a finished base. Let's get that base out of the way so we can enjoy the rest of the paint job. The base needs to follow my Shatterpoint recipe so that it fits with all the other minis I use for this game. The sandy bits get based with a mix of Citadel Baylor Brown and Vallejo Model Color Red Leather. The metallic grey building bits are base coated with Vallejo Model Color Neutral Grey. I then paint in the shadows using Vallejo Metal Color Dark Blue Grey for the non-sandy, and a mix of that colour with Vallejo Red Leather for the sandy. Often I have to do a bit of cleanup with the base tones after this step, but that's not an issue. A dry brush of medium sea grey on the non-sandy, and a dry brush of Citadel Baylor Brown, mixed with a tiny bit of Vallejo Model Color Ice Yellow for the sandy. A new thing I want to try on this guy is some pigment powders. But I'll want to do this on the finished boots too, so we can leave that bit for later. Done! One Shatterpoint base. Now that's out the way, this is where the fun begins. Recently I discovered, and by discovered I mean I watched better painters explain it and then tried it, how to paint white. Trevelyan does a great video on this, the secret being, don't paint with white paint. So Kenobi has some white clone style armor on him, and this needs to match all the other clone boys shown here that I've painted before off camera. I did a fair few white armored clones ready for my run at this paint job. We can take those practice runs, like a batch of tests, perhaps a test batch? The bad batch? For the armor I start by painting all the sections with Vallejo Model Color Medium Sea Grey. This light grey covers very well, and I don't need to worry about things getting too chalky. I leave the dark blue spray in the very dark recesses, and on the place where the shadows lie. Once this is done, I start a layering process. I take some Vallejo Model Color White Grey, much closer to pure white, and mix it in with the previous colour. Then I layer, add some more white grey, and layer some more. After a few layers, I stop painting the back of the mini and focus more on the areas that the light would be hit by our light source. Something I did with my clones was to ignore the shadow areas almost completely, and I think it left them a little flat from that angle. We continue to layer until we're almost at the point of pure white grey. Each time we add less and less of the new brighter colour, and we always make sure to not touch any bits that would be in the darker shadows. Once all the layering is done, I do an oil pin wash. For the wash I mix Abtalum Prussian Blue and Abtalum Smoky together. I give it about 10 minutes to dry before I clean up any spillages with a Q-tip and some white spirit. Then I let it dry overnight before a final cleanup using the same process. I found on some terrain I painted that I just couldn't get the oil off, so I want to make sure I don't have to repeat my white layering here. Another thing to consider is to not completely remove the oil wash. If I use too much white spirit, it removes the blue completely and becomes a rather pointless step. Now let's finish this armor with a crisp white edge highlight. I take my Vallejo model color white grey and edge highlight all of the panels, again considering where the light source is. There is no point in doing this to the shadow areas. Not only does it look odd, but it's more work for me. On areas where there are no edges, I do some scratchy highlights, super thin lines along the areas where the light would hit most. For the very last touch, I take the brightest white paint I have, Vallejo model color white, and put dots on very edges of the panels. Here is the finished clone armor of our boy Obi. I've made a mistake here. It's generally a good idea to paint inside out, so his underrobe or whatever it's called is where I should have started. Since I didn't, it's just going to be some lovely brush control practice. I take German grey and paint it into all the sections underneath his top robe, his underrobe, his underarmor. I still leave the purple blue base tone in the darkest recesses, and then assess afterwards if this looks right. I think it mostly looks good, so I keep going. I'm not going to spend too long here. I add some Vallejo model color white grey to my base, do a layer, add some more white grey, and another layer. Then we can call it done. The next biggest section on this model are the Jedi robes, and here I get to play with some texture. The tan light brownish robes of the Jedi are always an interesting one to paint for me. I normally add in some bone or off-white into a brown, and it gets very cream very fast. Last time on Anakin I added yellow instead of this, and it worked out pretty well, so we're going to try the same here. My base for the cloth will be Citadel Baneblade Brown. It looks like the right hue, and once I've put it on I can consider if I want this to be my midtone or my shadow by comparing it to some reference images. As I paint it on, I still leave the under base coat in the deepest recesses. Here you can see some of the reference images I bought. I knew for the armor it was white and needed to match my clones, but for robes I just have to match what we see here. I think I'll use the Baneblade Brown as my midtone, which means I need to paint in the shadows. We also have our pretty dark bluey purple from the airbrush, but I think I need to glaze the transition a bit so I can take some Vallejo model color purple and mix it with the Baneblade Brown. I then mix this and the glaze into any bit that wouldn't be hit by our light source. This means most of the back of the Mini gets this color with only a small amount of the previous color left there. With that done, I add some flat yellow into my Baneblade Brown and paint this onto the areas my light would hit. This went a tad more yellow than I wanted, so my next mix I add some more flat yellow and then a teeny bit of Vallejo model color white grey. With this mix I want to add texture, so I paint super duper thin lines in a grid pattern onto the light areas of the cloth. This was hard, but I really think it works well. Time to do it again and not mess it up. I add some Citadel Screaming Skull into my previous mix and get to draw in lines, even thinner and in even higher places than before. I got some feedback on this step. Both my partner and friends asked why he was wearing tartan, so I went back and added a boatload more thin lines. Now the big sections are done. We have a few small bits to finish before we get to the final part, his face and the blue glow. His belt is a reddish leather and has a tiny bit of metal detail, so before we move on to the saber, we need to get the brown done. I start by mixing Vallejo model color red leather with some German grey. I also throw in a bit of royal purple to see what I get. This base tone looks decent enough, so I carefully paint it over the whole belt. The lightsaber hilt for Obi is mostly metal, so I base coat with Vallejo metal color gunmetal grey. I then layer on top of this with Vallejo metal color Duralinium, considering where my light sources are coming from. Finally, I take Vallejo metal color aluminium and hit all the highest edges and add some tiny scratches to any flat areas that would get a touch of light. Now it's time to finish this Mini and do his face. I start by undercoating his face with Citadel Galv or Back Red. I'm hoping that this will aid me later as Caucasian skin has red from the blood vessels in the skin. We will see if this works. For his hair I base coated Vallejo model color Burnt Umber. Here we have to try and match the hair color that Obi has in the films. For this part we'll pull up this reference image and make an attempt to use it as a guide. I'm going to try something new and paint the whites of the eyes first. This way I can clean up using the dark red if I miss, which I probably will. Obi has blue eyes, so I'll attempt to do it properly and do blue before I do his iris. I take Vallejo Prussian blue and try to make a small dot. As with eyes, the amount of praying you do matters here. With the blue looking kind of okay, I do the same with a black dot. If it covers the blue, it's not an issue. I'm just trying to avoid making him look cross-eyed or super scared. So each time I did these eyes, I had to clean up and do the step again off camera. It's hard to paint eyes, and it's harder while filming. With the eyes done, I start on the skin with some Baneblade Brown and start to layer. The red should only be left in the very deepest shadows. After a few layers, I add in some Vallejo Model Color basic skin tone to bring the brown up to a more Caucasian skin tone. As I keep going, I try to consider the highest edges of where the light would hit, ignoring his neck and under his beard as I move lighter. The final bit is just pure basic skin tone. Now let's do his hair and lovely beard. For this I take burnt umber base tone and add some flat yellow. I layer on everywhere and give some basic definition, and then for the subsequent layers I focus more towards the front of his face. I then add a bit of Vallejo Monocolor white grey to my mix and add it to the very edges on the front. Finally I take my base, add some royal purple and paint this into the recesses of the back of the hair and neck. This is to match the shadow colours elsewhere and to match with the light direction I've used before. Okay, let me finish this off before I ruin everything. I take Vallejo Prussian blue and draw it along the top and bottom of the lightsaber, leaving the bright white running up the core of the blade. This is to show just how bright a lightsaber is in the core. So this is where we are, and I'm super happy with this paint job. I think it's one of the best that I've done. This means I'm super worried about ruining it by doing some crappy OSL from the blade. You can see here that I did some OSL when I painted Anakin, and I think that worked pretty well, but not great. So now I need to do a better job and try not to mess up a better paint job. Let's see how it goes. I watched a great video by Sarastro as preparation for this task, and it's one I would suggest anyone attempting OSL go watch. I know that the light from the blade will be different when it hits different materials, and the brightest bit will always be the light source, in this case, the blade. With this in mind, I take Prussian blue, the colour I used on the top of the blade, and I want to apply it to where the light would hit. For the white areas it will reflect well, but is also lighter than the blue I'm using, so I can't mix them. I take the Vallejo Model Color Prussian blue and add water until it's more of a glaze consistency. Then I apply it very carefully. I'm trying to tinge the white blue here, but I still make it look as if it's white armor hit with blue light and not just blue armor. For the black of the gloves and the brown of his hair, there's a darker than the blue. I was planning on mixing the blue into the base tone. However, once I had my glaze in place, I just tried applying this everywhere I thought the light would hit. Finally, I take the same glaze and add it to the hilt. Here I'm considering the light from the blade itself, but also bounce reflections from the white armor. Okay, I think I didn't ruin the model. Great success. I have one last thing to do. I mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to play with pigment powders. It is now time. I take some Vallejo burnt sienna pigment powder and add to the base and on his boots. I give it a bit of a tap to remove any super loose bits, and then I spray the whole thing with matte varnish. With that step done, it's time to double jump into reveal. Thank you for watching this video. I had a great time working on the famous negotiator. I have beard envy every time I look at him. Stay tuned for more, and to delve deeper into what we're doing, head over to castleofpaint.com.